The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. Welcome to the 92nd Street Y. I'm Jennifer Hausler from the Charles Simon Center for Adult Life and Learning. And tonight we'll have a discussion on the American War on Sex. Just a couple of events coming up I wanted you to know about. Tomorrow night, Bob Woodward will be here discussing his new book. And then on October 29th, Governor of New Jersey, James McGreevey, former governor of New Jersey, will be here with Andrew Sullivan to speak about being gay in political life. Right now, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Marty Klein, Reverend Barry Lynn, Joan Merton, and our moderator, Reverend Debra Haffner. Debra Haffner is the director of the Religious Institute on Sexual Morality, Justice, and Healing. She's an ordained Unitarian Universalist minister, and she is an endorsed community minister with the Unitarian Church in Westport, Connecticut. She was the chief executive officer of SECUS, the Sexuality, Information, and Education Council of the United States, and she's the author of several books, including From Diapers to Dating, A Parent's Guide to Raising Sexually Healthy Children, and more recently, A Time to Heal, Protecting Children and Ministering to Sex Offenders. Please welcome Reverend Debra Haffner.
Thank you. Good evening. Okay, now I'm a minister, so you got to do much, much better than that. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you. And we are really excited to be here and want to welcome you to this evening on America's War on Sex. We know you could have chosen to have heard Frank Rich and Barbara Walters tonight. And so it shows that at least for those of us in this room, sex sometimes trumps politics. I once read several years ago that there was a sexual revolution in America and sex won. And I think for those of us in the room, and there are a lot of us, who grew up and came of age sexually in the 60s and 70s, that indeed was a time where it seemed that sex was winning. It's a little hard to believe that in looking back, Richard Nixon was actually our friend on sexual rights. Some of you may remember that Richard Nixon signed the Title X First Family Planning Act in America. It was in 1973 that abortion became legal under the Nixon court. It was also in 1973 that the American Psychiatric Association and the American Psychological Association said that homosexuality was indeed not a mental illness. And so there was this period, halcyon period, of time where indeed sexual rights were expanding, which is no longer true in America. The last 25 years have seen an erosion of our sexual rights, what Dr. Marty Klein has named America's War on Sex. A war, in his words, in his terrific new book, where people are attempting to curb your sexual rights, your sexual freedom, and even your sexual imagination. I have in my own writings defined America as moderately erotophobic. Now, if we were completely erotophobic, we wouldn't be able to have sex. But because as a culture we are moderately erotophobic, for too many of us and too many of our friends and colleagues and indeed our partners carry within them a sense of fear and shame and guilt and misinformation and a history of negative experiences about their sexuality. And for too long, we've been denied sexuality information and sexual and reproductive health services. As a clergy person, I now see people every week who struggle with their sexuality, in part because of their religious messages. My organization is called the Religious Institute on Sexual Morality, Justice, and Healing, and when you go out at the end to buy Barry and Marty's terrific books, I've put a little brochure to tell you about the work that we do. We call on faith communities to be truth-seeking, courageous, and just, both within the faith communities and within society at large, including a faith-based commitment to sexual and reproductive rights. I personally believe there is a role for both science and faith in public life. I think as we listen tonight about all the attacks on sexuality, it is also important to remember that America is on, I first wrote the right side and changed it to say the correct side on most of the issues we're talking about. The majority of Americans, more than 90%, support family planning. Almost 90% of Americans support sexuality education. 62% of Americans support civil unions or marriages for committed gay couples. So in many ways, despite the attacks, despite the cultural confusion, we are really winning part of this war. I am delighted to have this opportunity to introduce you to three of my colleagues, wonderful people who are on the very front lines of those resisting the right. Each of them will speak for about 8 minutes. We will then have some questions that I will ask, and then we will open it up to you for audience questions. I will ask you to save your questions to the end rather than change the flow of the program. So I'm going to start by introducing my colleague and good friend, Marty Klein. Dr. Klein has been a licensed marriage and family therapist and certified sex educator in Palo Alto, California for 26 years. He's known for continually challenging the diagnostic and treatment categories of psychotherapy and sex therapy, particularly in resisting the idea of sex addiction. Marty is the writer and publisher of a terrific newsletter that he'd be happy to send you called Sexual Intelligence. It's an electronic newsletter that addresses the issues of the day. And I know many of you are subscribers, and I'm sure he'll tell you if you're not how to do it. He's been an expert witness, defendant, and consultant in many federal anti-censorship cases. In the foreword to his new book, I'll show you his book, Nadine Strawson refers to Marty as my longtime colleague in the civil rights movement. I'm proud to call him my long-term colleague in the sexuality movement, but more importantly, I want to tell you that Marty's also a great and very dependable friend. This book, Marty's Fifth, is also the name of tonight's panels, America's War on Sex. I hope you'll buy it on the way out. Dr. Klein.
Thank you. Thank you, Debra. That's really all you need to know. You can just go buy the thing and let me out of here. America's War on Sex. That's the overall description I use to describe the political laws, the social regulations, the cultural norms, and the corporate policies that are designed to regulate all aspects of our sexuality. Sexual behavior, sexual entertainment, sexual imagination, sexual education, sexual commerce, and sexual health care. America's War on Sex is led by what I call the sexual disaster industry. And there is so much money to be made scaring the hell out of Americans about sexuality that nobody on that gravy train can afford to slow it down. And any outsider, such as the four of us, any outsider who questions this juggernaut, this gravy train, is immediately labeled insensitive, anti-family, immoral, or a pedophile. The sexual disaster industry involves federal and local government, conservative religion, so-called morality organizations. I love that expression, morality organization. I always think that Planned Parenthood is a morality organization. Yeah. You know, the ACLU is a morality organization. AU, Barry, that's a morality organization. A religious institute, definitely. And National Coalition Against Censorship. Anyone else want to be a morality organization? All good organizations, I might add. The sexual disaster industry also includes right-wing think tanks, victim parade daytime talk shows like Montel and Maury, news programs looking for a bump. Isn't it awful the way that people go to strip clubs, film at 11? Now, that's the sexual disaster industry. Our current president proudly sides with the sexual disaster industry, along with dozens of Congress members, thousands of other elected officials. And he literally prays for the day that those who want to mind their own business and allow other people that same privilege will be conquered by those who want to mind everyone's business, forcefully imposing their fears and values on the vanquished. In my book, I discuss 7 battlegrounds in the war on sex: sex education, broadcast indecency, reproductive rights, the internet, which I think is here to stay, by the way, pornography, adult entertainment, and sexual minorities and sexual rights. What all of these battlegrounds have in public, clearly, is that they're about sexuality. Now, those who are waging war on sex, they don't say, well, it's all about sex. What they say is they want to protect America. They want to protect America's children, America's women, America's men, America's marriages, America's music, film, and television, America's property values, and finally, they want to protect America's national security. But this war on sex is not about protecting children. If it were, their strategy would not include enforcing sexual ignorance on children. It wouldn't include destroying the livelihoods of tens of thousands of women and men in the adult industry. It would not involve destroying the ability of gay couples to adopt children or to live with some of the same civil rights that other people have. In the 1990s, well, America's war on sex has long-lasting effects on American governance. And Jeffrey has told me not to focus too much on that, but I will tell you that in the 1990s, for example, the city of Erie, Pennsylvania, spent several $1 million to shut down a club where adults were watching women dance nude. The Supreme Court finally upheld the city's attempt, and in 2000, Justice Stevens, dissenting in this case, said, what did Justice Stevens say? He said, far more important than the question of whether nude dancing is entitled to the protection of the First Amendment are the dramatic changes in legal doctrine that the court is endorsing. He decried, as all of us need to be wary about, is the fact that the war on sex, the regulation of sexuality, is being used as a vehicle for changing the way that America is being governed. And repressive public policy around sexuality is, in addition to depriving people of rights and choices, it's leading to social problems. And it's also leading to personal sexual problems, including physical dysfunction, low desire, performance anxiety, compulsivity, shame, which of course are undermining relationships and families. So let's discuss this on a more personal level. The war on sex is hurting people in their bedrooms, in their child rearing, and in their neighborhoods. It's keeping couples from buying vibrators. Vibrators are illegal to sell in 6 states. More than 50% of the states in the United States, you can't legally sell a vibrator. So in Alabama, for example, it's legal to buy a gun, but not to buy a vibrator. So I'll leave you to figure what that's all about. The war on sex is keeping psychologists ignorant and misinformed about healthy childhood sexuality. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I had to get trained in spotting childhood sexual abuse, but I was trained nothing. I received no training in spotting healthy or evaluating healthy childhood sexuality. The next time you get a knee operation, you probably don't want to go to a doctor who only knows about damaged knees. You probably want to go to a doctor who knows about healthy knees as well. Well, your marriage counselor undoubtedly has no training in healthy childhood sexuality. The war on sex is keeping marriage counselors ignorant about the sexual practices of their clients, like the use of blindfolds or spanking, the way that most women have orgasm. Your average marriage counselor does not know that most women in America don't have orgasms, if they want them, from sexual intercourse, that they typically have orgasms from clitoral stimulation. So the war on sex is keeping marriage counselors ignorant about sexuality. The war on sex is keeping marriage counselors, psychologists, and psychiatrists ignorant about the way that men who look at pornography actually experience. It's preventing physicians from informing their patients about their contraceptive options. In many places, physicians are not allowed to discuss honestly all of the contraceptive options that their patients have. It's gagging school teachers in America who are not allowed to answer a broad range of questions in health education class. It's requiring teachers in many classrooms in America to actually teach lies, to actually teach that all premarital sex, all sex between people who are not married, inevitably leads to physical and emotional harm. That's the law if you accept money from sources funding abstinence-only programs. It's distorting what information can go on government websites. You can no longer trust what the government says on its own website about things like the impact of abortion on people's health. It's encouraging pharmacists and others to claim that they don't have to fill prescriptions that they're uncomfortable with, especially if they claim that the reason they can't fill those prescriptions is because they've been instructed by their God rather than having been instructed by Napoleon. Now, if pharmacists have the right to not fill your prescription, who else is going to claim that they don't have to do their job? So, for example, what about cab drivers who refuse to take you to a Planned Parenthood clinic? What about a 7-Eleven clerk who won't sell you alcohol because you shouldn't drink? What about a Bloomingdale's clerk who won't let you spend any money on goods made in China? What about a physician who won't let you have a blood transfusion because it's against God's will? What about a lawyer who won't write a will leaving your money to your lazy son? What about Debra McGee, a popular art teacher in a suburb of Dallas, Texas, who just lost her job last week for taking her class to the Dallas Art Museum, along with 4 other teachers and several docents from the museum. And when one of the 5th graders saw a nude statue and mentioned it to his mommy complained, and Ms. McGee has lost her job. So the war on sex is affecting people in very direct ways, very practical ways. And as insane as racial segregation was, in my opinion, as insane as racial segregation was, at least blacks had their own drinking fountains. But communities are not trying to establish restricted places where people can watch a stripper or buy a vibrator. They're trying to eliminate those options for people altogether. Now, half a world away, this country is spending mountains of money and buckets of blood to ease its fear about a group of faceless people who are trying to destroy the American way of life. What we notice is that from Maine to California, Americans are doing that to America right here. The Taliban would take away the right of a woman to wear short sleeves. Daytona Beach has taken away a woman's right to wear thong bikinis. The Taliban would prevent men and women from watching each other dance. Alabama prevents men from having a beer and watching women dance if they show their nipples. And the governments of Daytona Beach and Alabama have enacted their bans for the exact same reason that the Taliban enacted theirs. They know what's right and wrong. They have seized the power to make people live accordingly, and they know that it's for everyone's good.
Thank you. I'm now pleased to introduce you to Joan Bertin, who is the Executive Director of the National Coalition Against Censorship. She's a graduate of the NYU Law School, where she was a fellow in the Arthur Garfield Hayes Civil Liberties Program. After law school, she spent 7 years representing indigent clients as a legal services lawyer and more than a dozen years litigating civil rights and civil liberties cases at the ACLU. Joan has taught at Sarah Lawrence College, where she held the Joanne Woodward Chair in Public Policy, and she's currently on the faculty at Columbia University. What I want to tell you about Joan is when Joan took over the coalition, no one thought that you would ever be able to take the shoes of its founder. And what I think is really interesting is right this minute I can't remember that founder's name because Joan has done such an incredible job there.
Leanne Katz.
Wasn't.
I did have big shoes to fill.
You did have big shoes.
And I'm never sending you my resume again. Too embarrassing.
I wrote that.
Oh, you're the culprit. Thank you, Debra. Sexual politics in the United States is very confusing. Really very confusing. You could use other words to describe the situation. We were brainstorming about this in my office today. Schizophrenic was one of the words. Hypocritical, of course. Conflicted or just plain weird. People, whenever I give talks on the subject of censorship of sexual content, people from other countries invariably ask me, what is it with you Americans and sex? I don't know. but something. Official American policies relating to sex reflect this weirdness and its problematic consequences. Marty Klein's wonderful new book, America's War on Sex, provides examples of the wide range of issues affected by sexual politics and attitudes and the harms they cause. I see America's War on Sex through a First Amendment lens. So tonight I want to spend a little time focusing on the way these attitudes promote censorship and deprive Americans of important First Amendment rights. And this does, as Marty indicate, change the very rules on which our government functions. I'm going to start off with book censorship. As many of you probably know, book censorship is very much an issue in the United States, even though, fortunately, books aren't actually burned and authors don't often go to jail for writing about sex or gender issues as they do in other parts of the world. Still, hundreds of books are banned and challenged in public school classrooms and libraries every year in every state in the country. The majority of these incidents involve complaints about sex. Sexual content. I mean, I have the ALA's, a couple of weeks ago it was Banned Books Week. I don't know if you saw that. It's an annual event to remind people about the importance of intellectual freedom and the fact that censorship still exists in the United States. And every year the American Library Association Office for Intellectual Freedom tallies up the number of written reported complaints seeking to remove books from schools and libraries. And the reasons for them. This past year, well, for the year 2005, which was just released in September, the ALA received a total of 405 challenges. Now, as people from the ALA will remind you, this is probably, almost undoubtedly, the tip of the iceberg, because these are the written reported complaints, not the verbal complaints that are so often the trigger for removal in schools and classrooms. And these are the ones that come to the attention of the press that are publicly reported. So the estimate is that this is probably about 20%, 15 to 20% of the total number of instances. So of the 10 most challenged books of 2005, 7 were challenged because of sexual content. It's Perfectly Normal, a book by Roby Harris, which is a sex education book, was challenged for homosexuality, nudity, sex education, religious viewpoints, abortion, and being unsuited to age groups, whatever that means. Now, It's Perfectly Normal doesn't advocate homosexuality or anything. It explains it. Forever by Judy Blume, published more than 30 years ago now, is still number 2 on the most challenged books list because of sexual content. The Catcher in the Rye, number 3, sexual content. The Chocolate Wars by Robert Cormier, also sexual content. Detour for Emmy by Marilyn Reynolds, sexual content. What My Mother Doesn't Know by Sonia Sones for sexual content. And It's So Amazing, another book by Roby Harris, a sex ed book. It's called A Book About Eggs, Sperm, Birth, Babies, and Families for sex education and sexual content. That's sort of an overview. We've seen in it also a very, just recently, not necessarily reflected in these, but reflected in the calls that we get from writers and students and teachers around the country, a large number of challenges about books with homosexual themes or any kind of content relating to same-sex relationships. So even if these books are ultimately reinstated in a particular library, as for example, it took us 2 years, but we finally got Forever back in a school library in the middle in Elgin, Illinois. The message has already been sent to teachers and librarians not to order these books, not to shelve them, teachers don't put them on reading lists, or certainly don't assign them in class curricula. because they know if they do, they will get into trouble. Only one complaint can lead to trouble. Am I up already? 2 minutes. Oh, goodness. Okay. Sex ed. Okay, if you don't already know about federally funded abstinence-only education, you're in for a shock. As Marty's book explains in detail, the federal government provides funding for school-based programs that teach, quote, that a mutually faithful monogamous relationship in the context of marriage is the expected standard of human sexual activity, and that sexual activity outside of marriage is likely to have harmful physiological and physical effects. Now, a good number of the members of Congress who voted for this law plainly don't conform to its teachings. And I can't let pass the fact that it was signed by Bill Clinton in 1996. When the bill was voted on, abstinence education was buried in 250 pages of welfare reform legislation, and it passed with no debate and no dissent. In fact, few people even realized it existed until the dollars started flowing and the restrictions started to be enforced. The effects on kids aren't mysterious at all, however. One California teacher became alarmed when one of her female students asked if she could get pregnant from oral sex, and a male student asked where his uterus is. AIDS education programs that present information about safer sex practices have been canceled because they conflict with this law. And in some places, chapters and images from health textbooks have been razored out so that children cannot see them. Parents, when asked, resoundingly support comprehensive sex education, but even so, politicians keep reauthorizing abstinence-only program, and the money allocated to it increases every year, even as other education and health programs are cut. I'm going to try to go through art censorship very quickly. There's a simple line here: just forget about nudity. Doesn't matter whether it's Michelangelo or Rodin. Nudity in art, although part of art history throughout the ages and treated as sacred in many eras, is now taboo, the frequent target of critics who equate nudity with sex. The Texas art teacher who was recently fired that Marty just referred to. And another example is a New York, not city, but not so far out of the city, high school art teacher who was suspended and is still suspended after he advised students to sign up for a life drawing class if they plan to submit portfolios in their applications to college art programs. If I had more time, I'd talk about the FCC and how its campaign against indecency threatens to sanitize even PBS programming, but since I don't read Marty's book, everyone knows about the wardrobe malfunction, which, believe it or not, is still in the courts. That's just the tip of the iceberg. Ironically, while the FCC hands out fines, this has no effect on the popularity of sexualized imagery. As the art critic Peter Plagins recently observed in The Nation, every province of our culture is festooned with breasts and bums and breasts and crotch bulges and breasts and more breasts. The tide of prurience is unrelenting. As foreign observers remark, what is it with Americans and sex? Thank you.
Indeed. And as our third speaker, I'm privileged and proud to introduce you to Lynn, who has been the Executive Director of Americans United for Separation of Church and State since 1992. We're very glad to have Barry here tonight. He thought he was going to have to cancel and be on Larry King, but Larry King decided he needed to do David Carr again, so Barry gets to be with us. Barry, in addition to being an ordained minister of the United Church of Christ, is also a lawyer and a member of the D.C. Bar. He appears frequently on national TV, including the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour, Nightline, Larry King, and is regularly sparring with people like Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and Tony Perkins. One of my proud moments was when Barry and I shared a magazine by Focus on the Family where he was called a ferret and and a thug, and I was called the high priestess of immorality. What I have never had happen, honest, true, what I have never had happen, though, is what happened to Barry in September, which was when James Dobson, for 10 minutes of his talk at what they call the Value Summit, declared publicly Barry Lynn as his nemesis and spent 10 minutes railing against his current activities. So I like to think I have something to look up to Barry. Barry's new book is Piety and Politics, The Right-Wing Assault on Sexual Freedom, and just like Marty's book, it's really worth you buying and reading it. Barry.
Well, thank you very much. You know, on the 15th anniversary show of the now defunct Crossfire on CNN, the network thought that it would actually go and have this done in front of a live audience, which was very rare at the time, and they wanted to make sure that they could get two of the more controversial people that they have had on the previous programs. I'm sorry, I've been speaking for the last 2.5 weeks nonstop. So what did they do? They invited, of course, myself and the Reverend Jerry Falwell. And on that somewhat cramped stage that night, there were the co-hosts at the time, Pat Buchanan and Jerry Ferraro, and then Reverend Falwell and myself. And just about 20 seconds before we went on the air, Jerry Falwell turns to Pat Buchanan and says, can we move the set a little bit? Because Barry's knees are touching mine. I'm going to ask Debra for forgiveness for this, but all of a sudden I saw an opportunity. And after Jerry Falwell first answered his first question, in which he explained how upset he was that the Walt Disney Company had used what he called an erotic image in a newly released cartoon, I, of course, turned to Jerry and said, while touching his hand, Jerry, if it bothers you this much, don't watch it again. Now, if that incident is anything, it might be a microcosm of the problem that you get into when you mix the religious right with human, or perhaps even with animated, sexuality. Unfortunately, the religious right always rejects the idea that they're theocratic. They hate that adjective. James Dobson just told me that again a few weeks ago, literally in person. But how else can we explain what it is that motivates them on public policy decisions around sexuality, around gender, and around procreation? When you find protesters outside of women's clinics on Saturday mornings, they are not waving around the Constitution of the United States. What are they waving around? Bibles. Ironically, a book that does not even mention abortion. And indeed, the very idea that is promulgated by the religious right today, that there's a moral and legal equivalence of murder and abortion, would have been found laughable by the early church itself. The early Roman Catholic Church believed that a fetus became of any moral consequence only after the process of ensoulment, when the soul entered the body, which was 30 days after conception for a male and 60 days after conception for a female. Now, yeah, see, you think that's funny, but you're probably thinking, now, why would that be? And I've thought about it literally for 2 decades, and I just think that the church realized even then that men take longer to figure out where they are, amniotically or otherwise, and know that we'll never ask for direction. So, admittedly, those people who believe that the Bible is literally the basis for our modern law, or should be, I have a little bit more to go on in the Bible by quoting from the Holiness Codes, the book of Leviticus, and finding out that those do indeed prescribe homosexuality, eating oysters, wearing clothes of mixed fabric. But curiously, the only public religious right protests about any of these are directed at gay and lesbian Americans. I mean, how often have you seen anyone offer a peep of criticism of the Pearl Oyster Bar, or, moan about the shirt selection and its mixed polyester and cotton fabrics at Walmart? Very, very rarely. Although these Bible-based arguments are in fact what are at the heart of what the religious right thinks about these issues, they don't really like to say it, because to say it means that they have to concede that they really are trying to turn the religious precepts of one religious group into the legal system of the entire United States. And that makes a lot of people in the middle of America very, very nervous. So what do? They come up with other arguments. For example, they say, well, if we allowed gay people to marry, first thing that would happen is we'd have trouble with straight marriages. Presumably the 49% of straight marriages that don't already end in divorce, which the Bible has a comment about, and it is against it. On the claim, they sometimes claim that this effect will be it's almost supernatural. And I just try to understand this, but I don't believe it, because I just somehow don't believe that if the two gay men down the street from where I live in the state of Maryland somehow are allowed to marry and accept the rights and responsibilities of a civil marriage, that somehow I will be thrown into paroxysms of previously unrecognized lust and leave my marriage of 36 years. In fact, I've actually informed my spouse that that won't even happen if Charlene Theron moves into the neighborhood. So, I mentioned that Falwell incident was kind of a symptomatic of the thinking, a word which, of course, we have to use advisedly when we're talking about the religious right, but they are not just sexophobic, although they certainly are that, but they're phobic about so many things. They have a tremendous fear about almost everything. 2 weeks ago, a Georgia parent sued her school system down near Atlanta in order to have the Harry Potter books removed from the school library. And of course, her argument was it promotes witchcraft. The Reverend Lou Sheldon is a gentleman I debate a lot, and he's runs something called the Traditional Values Coalition. He agrees that Harry Potter should be taken away because it promotes witchcraft, but he also believes that it, quote, teaches homosexuality and abortion. Wow. Now, what is it that the Reverend Sheldon knows that we don't know? The only thing I'm thinking is maybe he knows that J.K. Rowling, sitting in her beautiful English garden to write the final book in the series, has titled it Harry Potter and the Morning After Pill. Because if he knows that, then I understand. Otherwise, I'm confused. These forces fear public education tremendously, and they fear the popular culture tremendously, and essentially for the same reason. The fear that a stray image or idea will eviscerate the whole values system that parents and their religious institutions have constructed. And maybe even more significantly, they fear that the very essence of modern education, which is something most Americans say they want, it's called critical thinking. To most of us, that's a good thing. But to the religious right, it's a terribly dangerous thing. And it's dangerous because it questions authority. It allows young people to say, well, maybe the teacher's not always right. Or maybe the government's not always right. Maybe the church isn't even always right. And that is so dangerous an idea that the religious right simply can't tolerate it. When you look at the public schools and what does and doesn't happen, you find a tremendous amount of hypocrisy, one of the words that Joan used. If it comes to the issue of evolution, Jerry's against it. He says, well, just because courts say that ideas like creationism and so-called intelligent design are not science, they're really just a religious philosophy, we don't have to take the courts at their word, and we can in fact and should in fact put all ideas out on the table, and as he put it once in a debate, let the children decide. Well, now, we don't do that in any other place, and moreover, when it comes to sex education, I can guarantee you that Jerry Falwell is never going to endorse the idea of, on the left side of the table, putting the abstinence brochures, and on the right side of the table, putting a condom and a banana. That is just never going to happen, and that's hypocritical. I was once on a Christian radio show where a caller called in and he said, I understand where Reverend Lynn's going with this, but what do you possibly tell children if you see two men walking down the street holding hands? I thought, what's a real showstopper? A stumper. I'd never thought of that. I said, sir, I live in Washington, D.C. When my son and my daughter and I go downtown, we frequently see men holding hands. And when they ask why, I say, because those men love each other just like your mom and I do. And that's usually the end of the discussion. You know, my kids at least never said, oh, okay, that was my first question. Now let's turn to bondage masks. You know, they just don't do that. But the right fears that that's exactly where they're going to go. And if we are not straight with kids, if we do not tell them that the real world exists, and yes, there are LGBTQI people in this world, right? And we don't tell them that, yeah, sex actually is fun, and that's why a lot of people engage in it. If we're not honest about that, they're not going to believe us when we tell them anything else either. So we better find age-appropriate, yes, but we better find ways to talk to our own kids and to have the public schools talk to our kids about these issues, or we are on a very dangerous trend, a trend toward hatred of what we don't understand and ignorance about what we must understand. And that's a bad trajectory for America, and it's wonderfully chronicled in Marty's new book.
Thank you. So I have some questions for the panel, and I've asked them to try to keep their answers to under a couple of minutes so we can all participate. I think one of the most curious things when I think about my 30 years in this work is that for the last 25, we have seen this erosion, and it looks like, in Marty's words, that the war on sex is succeeding. We have abstinence-only education. We have restrictions on abortion. We have South Dakota passing an abortion ban. We had 11 states in the last election voting to ban gay marriage. We have people in Alabama and other states re-electing people who tell them that it is illegal for them to use vibrators. So my question is, why? What's happened in the last 25 years? Why would people vote to restrict other people's sexual rights?
The question is, why would people vote to restrict their own sexual rights? That's the first thing. I think that what we've seen is that there's a political movement. There's a political movement that deliberately creates fear in American culture around sexuality. There's a political movement that has created the specter of this sexual other, this out-of-control, dangerous sexual other, these sadomasochistic lesbians who are knocking down your door in the middle of the night, these that everywhere we look, sexuality and sexual energy is dangerous, and people must protect themselves from it, and by extension must protect their communities from it. And so when people are driven to fear the sexuality that stalks the land, what they do is they vote to protect themselves. They vote to protect themselves by restricting the rights of people to engage in certain practices, to imagine certain things, to get involved in things that are going to lead to dangerous consequences. And I think what we've seen is the religious right very meticulously creating a sense of fear that people respond to. And the way that people respond to that fear is to try and make themselves and their children safer. And as we all know, when you're frightened and you want to protect the people you love, you'll do anything. And that's what we're looking at in this country today. People willing to give away whatever rights they need to give away in order to do what they believe will protect themselves from this danger that they believe is out there stalking the land.
Joan?
Well, I've thought a lot about why certain topics are demonized, and certainly we see it in our work all the time. And I can't say that I have an answer that I'm satisfied with, but I have a couple of observations. One is that there is, of course, a very long history of demonizing sex in this country. I was just reading a little cheat sheet on the Scarlet Letter this afternoon, 1850, and then I was looking back at the history of Anthony Comstock's crusade against the anti-vice squads and the mailing of information, and we just did a little fact sheet on movie censorship in the early part of the 20th century. I mean, in a sense, I think that the baseline for this country is repression of sexuality, and that we've had some periods of more progressive behavior, but we're kind of back now, 2 steps forward, 1 step forward, 2 steps back sort of thing. But let's not forget, Margaret Sanger went to jail. information about sexuality, any access to contraception is a product of legal challenges in the 1960s and 70s. It's not that long ago that states restricted access to contraception. So I think that, we tend to have to forget about that. But and the other comment or observation, which I don't know, whether these two things are consistent, but they seem to be happening at the same time, is that through our popular entertainment, we are obviously obsessed with sex. And what politicians do and what people do are completely, what politicians enact into law and say on the stump is completely unrelated to how people live their lives. I mean, there's a terrible cognitive dissonance going on in this, national discussion that I can't reconcile in a rational way. So those are my non-answer to your question.
I think just to follow up on what Joan said, I do think we sometimes forget just how terrible things were in the arena of censorship, for example, within our own lifetimes. I mean, Lenny Bruce, remember, was convicted for obscenity for words alone that he uttered in nightclubs in this city. It wasn't in Birmingham, Alabama. It was this city. We had, I found a stash of old comic books. They're worth a lot of money. If you have any, give them to me. And they were approved by the Comics Code. Even comic books had a regulatory body that made it possible or impossible to sell comic books because comic books were deemed to be a menace, sexually and for purposes of violence, to America's young people. Pat Buchanan and I, to go back to Pat Buchanan a minute, and I used to do a radio show for 3 hours every afternoon on NBC. I know it was hard for people to believe that I could sit in a small room with Pat for that long, but we did. And I recently had him on my new radio show where I don't have a partner and therefore can say anything I want. I had him on as a guest, and I said, Pat, we used to talk all the time about the culture war. Are we winning it, or am I winning it, or are you winning it? And he said, frankly, Barry, you're winning it. And I think the factors are these. Demographics. He can look at the same studies we look at and find out that, yes, same-sex marriage, very unpopular if you're 60 plus, unless you're in this room. But then 40 to 50, more balanced. By the time you get to the young people of this country, they're all for it. They don't see a reason to be against it, I should say. The same with the internet. People, you can hide, you used to have to hide the Playboy magazines in somebody's drawer in the house, and the kids would find them anyway. But now, and I don't know that this is entirely a good development, but now all you have to do is have access to the internet, and you can learn everything you would possibly want to know and a lot you wouldn't want to know about sex in America and around the world. So I think to that extent, the cat's out of the bag. The mechanism for discovering this information is out there, and there is, as Marty pointed out, no stopping certain of these developments.
I want to add, some of you may have seen the New York Times obituary on Gary Stubbs this weekend. Mm-hmm. It opened up by saying, Representative Stubbs died while walking his dog, his husband said. And to me, that was as much an example of how we are winning on some things than anything I had seen in a long time. And even more, the AP story, which runs in Alabama and Texas, identified his partner as his husband. So we do see some good change. So let's shift a little bit and talk about, Marty argues somewhat in his book that religion has too large a role in the setting of public policy. Now, I left my career as a sexologist to become an ordained minister precisely to bring a religious voice into the public sphere. Barry walks a line of bringing both of those. But the question in these debates is, what really should the role of religion be in these discussions? And should science have a different kind of role? You want to start with you, Barry? We'll go to the other minister and walk backwards
We could. I think that the role of religious institutions is to be one of those institutions that does talk openly and honestly about these issues of human sexuality. And it is really tough to do that. It's at least as tough to talk about these issues in your church as it is in the public schools or anywhere else. But if a vacuum exists and no one learns about sexuality from anything other than the movies and the internet, they certainly get a very skewed, or shall we say limited, view of what is encompassed by that phrase, human sexuality. I don't think that religious groups ought to be asking members of Congress to have debates about the rights of gay and lesbian Americans by having Bible quoting wars on the floor of the House and the Senate. And sometimes I do think people get that impression that they ought to counter every bad quote with some other quote. But the scriptures of no particular religion have any special authority in this country. So I don't want to do that. But I do want those religious voices to be out there and let political people know that there are values that we care about as religious people that are consistent with, among other things, allowing other people to make their moral decisions on matters of human sexuality. I mean, one of the reasons that the religious right is engaged in the battle against reproductive choice, and it's not just about abortion. As you know, this is really about contraception. Most of the advocates in the religious right believe almost every form of contraception is an abortifacient. It causes, it induces abortion. So these issues are ones that sweep out an enormous amount of, would sweep away enormous amounts of moral choice for individual Americans if this became the law of the land. Ironically, it was not so much in the beginning of life, but at the end of life that I think Americans in the middle of America saw this most clearly about 18 months ago with Mrs. Terry Schiavo, a woman who had made a choice. To the extent anyone could figure it out, it was to withdraw artificial food and hydration. And all of a sudden, Congress is back in session. The president is flying back from his ranch to sign a bill to say, wait a minute, the states, the Florida courts have spent 10 years deciding this, but we don't think it's right. We're going to reevaluate it. When Americans start to realize that the right wing of religion wants to direct your life from the moment of conception until the moment of death, and they'll define them both, we're in deep trouble. And that's why 80% of Americans, after 1 week of hearing about Mrs. Schiavo, said that Congress and the president were wrong to intervene in that case. And there's similar numbers when it comes to contraception. We just have to remind people that you can make those moral judgments yourself, and what better place than the churches, the synagogues, the temples, the mosques of this country to start having that discussion with our own families.
I may be in the minority here, but I'm going to take the position that no public policy should be founded on religious conviction, and that certainly people are entitled to any religious beliefs they want and can live their lives according to any religious beliefs they want. But under the Constitution, it seems to me that atheism is equally valid a belief system as any, theistic belief. It's interesting because we confront the issue of religious speech quite frequently. People who are religionists claim all the time that they are denied their free speech rights. Certainly we do support the right of individuals to hold their own religious beliefs and to speak in any public setting about those beliefs. But that is a very different thing from members of the government announcing that they are adopting certain policies because of their religious beliefs. Well, to that extent, they're imposing their religious beliefs on me, and I don't happen or necessarily need to believe in those. One little interesting example involving free speech claims by the religious right has to do with the creationism, intelligent design, evolution debate. In the Pennsylvania case in which the court struck down the requirement that intelligent design be taught alongside of evolution, the religious proponents of that policy claimed that their free speech rights to promote intelligent design were being trampled on. And as we tried to explain in our own materials and to reporters who called about it, you have a right to believe whatever you want to believe, but you don't necessarily have a right to have it taught in the public schools. The standard for what gets taught in the public schools is determined by educators based on what the educational state of knowledge is. And just as Barry said, it's the notion that you will present to school children two theories of the origins of life as if they are equally valid and expect them to decide is bizarre and peculiar. They are in school to learn what knowledge has been generated before them, not to try and figure out between two competing schools without guidance from people who have studied the question closely. So that is not a free speech claim. Nobody has a right to have their views adopted in the public sphere. You have a right to hold your views, but that's all they are. They're yours. That's Marty.
That's why I love you, Joan.
Atheist that I am.
First of all, I'm terribly troubled by the idea that the personal religious beliefs of elected officials should have any more standing in their work as public officials than what they like to eat for lunch. It's offensive to me that an elected official would say that there's certain things that they believe that that they are obligated to impose on the rest of us simply because they're religious. Again, I would like to hear elected officials say that because I believe that we should give Louisiana back to the French, here's what we need to do, instead of saying this is because what God says. So I'm troubled about the idea that elected officials can't separate their personal, or aren't obligated, don't feel obligated to separate their personal religious beliefs. When I go to a physician or a dry cleaner, I'm interested in what they provide as a physician or a dry cleaner. I don't want to know about their personal religious beliefs, and I don't want them imposed on me. The second thing is that it troubles me that that religion has special standing. As you said, a group of atheists should be considered exactly alongside of a group of people claiming a certain religious belief. And why religious belief has special standing at the public policy table? I find that extremely troubling. Why not left-handed people united want to have special standing to discuss the state of the arts funding? The third thing is that it seems to me that people who care a lot about religion for themselves, people who are personally very involved in religion, have to make a decision for themselves about, now that they know the right way for them to live, they have to decide do they now know the right way for everyone to live or not? Or have they merely discovered the right way for themselves to live? Once people decide that they have discovered the right way for everyone to live, then they have to make another choice, which is that, should that have standing in the public policy sphere? I think it's repulsive that anybody actually feels that because they have decided the best way for them to live, that they now have some special insight into the way that other people should live, to such an extent that that belief should be codified into law. And my understanding is that the reason that religion has special tax exemptions is because they have their own institutions through which they can attempt to influence the way that other people live. So I go to Debra's church, or I go to Joan's atheistic group, which should be equally tax exempt, and that's the place that you attempt to influence me. But the public sphere, the public policy sphere, should not be the place that you are allowed to attempt to tell me how I must live, simply because you figured out the right way for you to live.
Okay, I'm going to, because of time, exercise my own discretion, but to tell you that I disagree with some of that.
Most of it, I think.
But I want to go on and ask my one last question, then we'll open it up for discussion, which is, although I love Marty's book, I didn't love the title so much because I worried about the idea of talking about a war on sex. And so I'd like to ask the other panelists, does that metaphor help us in these debates if we set ourselves up as in the midst of a cultural war, which, as I recall, it was James Dobson who first declared us being in a cultural war from Focus on the Family. I mean, what about seeking common ground with these people? Shouldn't we be trying to look for how we work together?
Actually, once again, it was actually Pat Buchanan who said it at the Republican National Convention in Texas, I guess in '88. We are in a cultural war for the soul of America. That was one of the two things he ever said in the course of the time I knew him that actually agreed with. So I'm not as troubled, I have to tell you, about that imagery, because I think we have to understand that part of what drives people to war is a passion for their commitment to the idea, not that war is necessarily the way you deal with it, but if you're not pretty passionate, you probably don't accept your values so strongly that you are literally willing to kill somebody in order to achieve them. If we said this was we were having a little America's fuss over religion, you see, then I'm afraid people would say, that lacks passion. It's all analytical, it's all very rational. And in fact, we got to get really angry sometimes. And the war metaphor just doesn't bother me, Debra. I understand where you're going with it, but I just...
So what about seeking public common ground?
Okay, well, I have spent a lot of time seeking common ground with these folks, and sometimes you actually find some. We found after 2.5 years of work with a group, left, right, and center, on the faith-based initiative, we came up with 38 recommendations that would not, we felt, violate the constitutional rights of anybody. That's why even People for the American Way and Americans United kind of signed on to these, and so did some of the most far-right people you can find. We presented them to Congress. I should mention not one of them has been enacted to this day, to legally and constitutionally find a way to partner between religious and secular groups and the federal government with some of these what are now called faith-based and community monies. So sometimes you work hard, you actually do achieve something, doesn't get enacted. The other problem is more frequent. I'm convinced after a lot of these common ground meetings that the only common ground the other side's looking for with me is a grave that they can put me in and the rest of us on the panel and most of you, because they're not really serious about it, because there is no creativity to the compromises they would consider, so they don't consider any at all. That's the problem.
Okay. Joan?
I think common ground is certainly, a desired effort and goal, and is possible among groups who can allow for different outcomes. For example, I'm trying to figure out the best way to say this. We have many supporters of NCAC who are libertarians, with whom, who would not agree, let's say, on a lot of liberal politics, but they are basically, sort of rationalists, free thinkers, want people to be able to decide things for themselves. On the substantive policy issues, we might disagree rather vehemently, let's say, over gun control. But they have a a basic tenet, and this is, in some respects what the Republican Party used to be, a basic tenet that allowed people to make their own decisions, that believed in government not being too intrusive, and allowed people, and had this theory of sort of less government, as people used to say. The current breed of Republicans are very different, and there's not a lot of space for finding common ground, since fundamentally what we advocate is individual responsibility and decision-making and individual rights, and what they advocate is a very top-down system where people follow certain rules that are set out for them. So, it sort of depends on the moment, it depends on the topic. I think we all on our side of this discussion try to find what you might call some unusual suspects. I mean, in a sense, to advocate with us, in a sense, the coalition itself, which has got 50 national nonprofit groups as part of it, is a coalition of organizations that don't necessarily agree on a whole lot of issues, but they have one common interest, which is that they all have something to gain from strong First Amendment rights. So, I mean, we may disagree with people in the labor movement or people in some religious organizations about various policy objectives, but we do agree on the core value of the First Amendment. And that's one way in which we achieve common ground.
So, Marty, why America's war on sex?
The publisher insisted.
Do you mean why that way of conceptualizing?
Right. Why the metaphor? Does it help? Is there another way to think about it?
Barry, I'll go you one step further. I think they want to destroy our access to our own sexuality. And that makes it a war. And I'm not giving that up without a fight. They want to destroy our access to our own sexual imagination. That makes it a war, Debra. And I'm with you. I haven't found that they have the flexibility or the creativity to want common ground. I mean, their vision of a society that works is so dramatically different from mine. And what they mostly don't agree on is the fundamental rules of the American covenant, The fundamental rule of the game here is that everybody in America has to agree to be willing to be a little uncomfortable sometimes about what other people do when those other people are minding their own business. And the deal is, if you're willing to let other people do what they want to do when they're minding their own business, you get to do what you want to do when you're minding your own business. That's the fundamental rule of the game. What I hear the religious right saying is that they want to get rid of that rule. They are claiming that under certain circumstances, and those circumstances happen to be about sex just by coincidence, under certain circumstances, they want to get rid of that necessity. They want to get rid of that covenant. They say they are not obligated to tolerate their own discomfort when they think about what I'm doing in the privacy of my own home. And once anybody says that they're not willing to play by that rule of the game's over. And what we're seeing now is the beginning of social breakdown as people are in conflict about, do you have to tolerate what your imagination creates when you think about what I might be doing when I'm minding my own business? And that is what makes it a war.
And I would, to just add, which is I think America is really tired of this war. And I think that the middle of America wants us to find another way. And I often talk about that America, I think, understands that we have privacy in our bedrooms. And there was a full-page ad, some of you may have seen it, in the New York Times probably 10 years ago, that had two people in bed. And the two people are in bed. You couldn't tell what sex or gender they were. And neither of them had on wedding bands, but it was clear they were in bed. And the tagline for that ad said, "Who you sleep with is your business. how you sleep is ours. Call 1-800-mattress.
Great, eh?
That's where I think most of America is. So let me open it up to all of you. If you would tell us your name. If you are going to make a comment, please make it shorter than these answers. But we would really like you to ask the panelists questions. Yes, sir.
This is from Mr. Klein. You were talking about the fact that the right really isn't really that interested in youth, because if they were interested in youth, they would allow sex education in the schools. But from their perspective, their attitude is that we don't know who's teaching our children about sex. We don't think that maybe what they're teaching is proper for what we believe is about sex, and that if they have, weird ideas or unusual ideas about sex, we certainly don't want them to be taught to our child in this public setting, and we don't have an opportunity to be available to correct those ideas. So my question to you is, how do you combat that type of argument?
I am completely sympathetic to that concern. I don't want school teachers teaching my kids weird ideas either. I don't want teachers teaching my kids weird ideas about slavery, or about Native Americans, or about astrology. So what we have is standards of education in every field. We even have them, or used to have them, Debra helped develop them, thank you very much, Debra, for comprehensive sexuality education. And if this person over here is a teacher of sex education and she goes home at night and spanks her partner, that should play no role in the way she teaches sexuality education, because we have standards. Any more than the way that she teaches about the American Civil War should have anything to do with how she feels about blacks or about slavery. So you're absolutely right that every good parent is concerned about what their kids are being taught. And that's why every subject that's being taught in public school needs to refer back to standards of education, standards that are based on what respected educators have to say, and what studies show is effective, both in terms of pedagogy and in terms of content.
But those also, at a certain point, those arguments are played out in some room where, well, we're not going to be able to talk about this, so there's a lot of give and take before those standards are created. Sometimes the honest truth maybe is killed because we can't really, so standards aren't always, the truth maybe.
Well, that's not so good, is it?
Does that happen?
Ask Debra.
Yeah,
This is your chance, Debra.
Well, in my former life, I was the president of SICUS, the Sexuality Information Education Council of the United States, and what we know is that some of this is a straw man. America wants their kids taught comprehensive sexuality education, including talking about abstinence, including talking about contraception, including talking about STDs. Every state allows parents to opt their children out of programming in this area, and I think probably only in this area. Less than 1% to 2% of parents take their children out. Parents want the help, but the better states have a law. Washington State championed this law, which said that before you opt your child out of a program, you have to read the curriculum and meet with the teacher. After you've gone through the curriculum and met the teacher, if at that point you don't want your child to take that course, you don't give permission. That allows people to know, because often what people think is that what we're doing in sex education is teaching their kids to have sex. And yet when we did a national study and looked at what was the topic most missing from America's sex education programs, it was sex. Sex was the most missing area. And then what my colleague Leslie Cantor has called the non-kosher topics, ham, homosexuality, abortion, and masturbation. So when we look, parents really do want these programs taught. They want the help. They also want it in their churches, synagogues, mosques, and they want to do a better job themselves.
When I was writing this book, which is also for sale out there, Piety and Politics, it came out a few weeks ago, I sometimes felt like I was writing a child-rearing book because I was telling stories about how just I, as a parent, dealt with some of these issues. What happens when your son comes up and says, you know, everybody in my class has seen an R-rated movie except me. How do you deal with that? You have to buy the book to find out my answer. But it's on sale. But thank you for the, probably the publisher. There's a lie told by the religious right that says you cannot keep your values and your education of your own children safe because one exposure to an idea by a teacher or the principal will somehow erase all of that background and all of that teaching. And I think it really disempowers parents to understand that they can make a difference. They can transfer values, including religious values, if they choose to do that, without it being swept away because some teacher, you know, talks about masturbation a year before the kid thought of it.
Can I add one thing? It's also, I think, important to recognize that there are some bad teachers, and there are some teachers who handle subjects poorly in school, but you're kind of, you know, conflating issues when you take a bad teacher and then say that the whole subject is bad to teach. Just because, and I think some of the criticism over you know, teaching values relates to the fact that even mentioning certain topics offends certain people's values. But there are, in addition to the interest that the school has and that the teacher has in presenting information and that the parent has in communicating values, there's also a separate, very important interest that the child has in learning what he or she needs to know to live as an adult in this society. And, you know, in my view, that First Amendment right of access to critical knowledge is not a right that parents can always necessarily infringe. There are independent rights that children have. We don't recognize them legally very often, but they are certainly there.
Sir, I'm blue.
Did you want me to say my name?
Sure.
Okay, my name is Perry Brass. You haven't mentioned anything about the corporatization of the country and how that is working towards restricting sexuality. I mean, like a good example is that our biggest retailer, Walmart, is famous now for censoring what goes on in Walmart, what can be sold in Walmart. PayPal, which is the banker of the internet, several years ago did a massive crackdown on websites. I'm a writer and I publish my own books, and they try to censor my website because my books have pictures of half-naked men on them. And I said, well, they were no worse than any bodice rippers covers. I found out that they had done this to about 400 websites. It made national news what they were doing, and also found out that PayPal is now very much involved with the right wing. So it seems like this has become a corporate situation too.
Very much so. And for me, without spending 3 hours of your time discussing this now, for me,
2 minutes.
Right. For me, the two places I see this very strongly are, number one, the concentration of ownership of the mass media, where there's a few people who are determining which bookstores, which television stations, which radio stations, which newspapers are going to have any mention of Barry's book or my book, etc. So that's the first thing. And the FCC, which was originally not designed to patrol the content of what you see on television, partly what the FCC was designed to do was to prevent the concentration of ownership of the airwaves. They've completely let that go. In fact, they went so far that even Republican members of Congress had to challenge them a few years ago and say, you people have gone even further than we want you to go. So that's the first place. The second place, and here's a real nightmare scenario. All of the adult materials in the United States basically are paid for through Visa and MasterCard, anything having to do with the internet. If you self-publish, you sell your books on the internet. If Visa decides they don't want to accept payment,
Nightmarish.
it's a nightmare scenario. If you pay for any adult materials over the internet, anytime Visa or MasterCard decides that they no longer want to handle anything having to do with sadomasochism, anything having to do with sexual orientation, anything having to do with challenging Congress, Visa and MasterCard are such influential players on the entire internet that the second that they sneeze, you'll never be able to buy a vibrator on the internet ever again.
Yeah, but let's be clear of one thing. There are a lot of legal controls over what the government can do, including local school boards and libraries, public schools and libraries. There are very few legal controls over what private entities can do. So this is like Visa, like Walmart. So these problems are problems that have no obvious solution, no way to enforce. These are sort of structural problems of capitalism that relate to government policies having to do with allowing conglomeration of industries. They are really much bigger systemic problems about having to do with how the power of the corporate entity has increased enormously. In a sense, almost corporate power is probably equal now to government power, or nearly so, and that's an unprecedented state of affairs. I mean, one of the reasons why we have the Bill of Rights is because the founders of the drafters of the Constitution recognized the government as a source of almost unlimited power, and that power had to be restrained. Nobody is recognizing in any structural legal way that corporations are rivaling government in the extent to which they can exercise power over individual lives. Bigger problem than we've been discussing here.
Sir, you had your hand up?
Yes, I did. My name is Lloyd Bailey. I saw Bishop James Robertson speak just this past week, the Episcopal Bishop from New Hampshire. He really, in his opinion, thought that the opposition to his becoming a bishop in the Episcopal Church was not about him at all, but was more about the decline of the power of the patriarchy. And I've not really heard very much discussion about that. It seems to me that there's a certain status quo that you don't want to critically question. That status quo will be the power of straight, white males. They're the ones who kind of win if the structure is not questioned. Any comment on that?
Well, I think he's absolutely right. I think that there's an enormous amount of this power politics that's being played, and it becomes convenient to overlay it with these issues that, like the rights of gay people. But the substantive issue is to retain the power, and that's certainly the case, and always has been the case, not just in the far right, but I think in a lot of middle and even left of center organizations. But remember, it was the religious right that set up a group called Concerned Women for America that had no actual women leadership and does not to this day. So yeah, they want to use the terms and act as if they're giving some power away, but when push comes to shove, the power goes right back where they think A, it started, and where they think B, it belongs.
I would also say that the struggle in the mainstream denominations around the issues of full inclusions of gays and lesbians is actually a reflection of their inability to deal with sexuality in general. I've had many ministers in the African American community say to me, Debra, the day I can talk about heterosexuality in the pulpit is the next day when I'll start talking about homosexuality. American churches, by and large, are still based on the philosophy of chastity until marriage, fidelity after marriage, which leaves out 75 million Americans who are not in marital situations, who are adults. And the churches, by and large, don't talk to their straight single adults, no less their young people
they're elderly people, marriages that are in trouble. And so that until we start really rationalizing, which is actually what my organization is all about, is trying to train clergy, train congregations to be sexually healthy, to deal with all of the sexual health issues. So I think patriarchy is a piece of it, but I think actually it comes fundamentally down to an erotophobia that says if you want to control people, control their sexuality. Okay, I'd like to hear from a woman. Rachel, and then over here, and I think that's the last question.
You've all sort of talked about a little bit, you've raised the question, why America? Why are we so different from Europe? Have you thought about this? Is there anything we can learn about the differences that you may have observed? But I've often wondered about that. How come we're still stuck where we are? Europe seems to have solved this problem rather nicely in terms of sex education, in terms of their whole attitude towards sex.
I think religion, frankly, is the answer, sadly, to that. Not that it always has to be, but here you find Europe with state churches, forced contributions unless you opt out. In Germany, for example, you end up giving a religion tax unless you opt out of it. It has led to nice churches, lots of government-supported, taxpayer-supported renovations of cathedrals, but very few people in those churches. And I'm not going to be an advocate for the same thing happening in the United States, because I do think this is where Debra and I do see this very similarly, I think, and that is that until we have these conversations in the churches, and until a church does get to the point that Marty talked about, where people can honestly make their own moral choices, and the church will say, we'll accept that. We'll tell you what we think. We will not use the power of government to impose what we think on everybody. That's the difference. In Europe, they gave up that imposition of the power of their religious beliefs, in part because the churches didn't have as many members, so they lost some of the political clout they had had before. In other countries, though, I got to tell you, I was in Australia a couple of years ago. People wondered what I did. They were shocked. The newest appointee, or soon-to-be appointee to the High Court of Australia, found out I was in the country, said he wanted to have breakfast with me. And he said, the first 15 minutes of the conversation, I think, when he said, "What's your average day like?" And I told him the kinds of things we fight about. I think he believed me to be mentally unstable. And then he started to think, and he said, you notice that in the legislature, when we talk about stem cells, all of a sudden there are people coming in with the Bible. I said, yes, that's exactly how it starts. And that's why I hope you're a good civil libertarian in Australia's High Court, because by the end of the conversation, he was clearly clued into the possibility this could happen elsewhere with immigration, as well as, because with immigration comes the fear, some more of the fear that the gentleman back here talked about. The Christian majority goes, whoa, we got to find a way to gain more power because those people are coming across the border.
Okay, ma'am, you and
Yes, Dorothy BG. Well, the masses do have power to decide how to run corporations, because you can decide either to become a stockholder of a company or withdraw your equities from a company or whatever should you want to do in terms of dealing with Visa or MasterCard or whatever, or online for that matter. But the other thing is...
do you have a question? Is there a question for the panel in here?
Well, I would make a comment about something that you had mentioned, but the reason that it appears to me that it's difficult to have compromises is that their perceptual boundaries are too far to the right. So they see the world in a very dualistic manner. Right, wrong, good, bad. So there is never a middle ground, and therefore it makes it very difficult to compromise on any level.
I think that's true, and although we would probably say we think we're right, I mean, about all these issues, we are advocates for these ideas, but on the other hand, we also recognize that people in good faith, if they have it, with or without religious faith, could actually reach other conclusions. But you're right, the other side does not see it that way. It's all in the text of one book, and it is infallible. The Bible is infallible, inerrant, and every word is absolutely correct. And that's what Jerry Falwell would tell you if he were in this panel.
I'm going to give Marty the last word since this is his party, and this is around his book. I hope that the panelists will stick around. I want to make one more plug. There are 2 really terrific books out there, and if you want to find out about progressive religion, I hope you'll pick up our brochure. Here, I have one too. Okay, Marty, last word. I've never seen him speechless.
We're not the ones who are obsessed with sex. When people on the religious right see 2 men walking down the street holding hands, all they can think about is anal sex. When the religious right sees the shriveled, exposed breasts of the concentration camp victims on Schindler's List, what they see is titties and good times. When the people on the religious right see an ad for family planning services, they think of orgies. These people are obsessed with sex, and I think they need some help in seeing sexuality in the larger, healthier context of adult life.
Thank you so much for coming. And thank you to the panel.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.